Okay, it is 1 minute past 12. So let's make a start. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody to today's event, Levelling Up. What does the white paper mean for devolution? The event is in partnership with Policy at Manchester and the University of Manchester's Policy Engagement Institute. Only a month ago, it seems longer I know, the government published its Levelling Up white paper, which set out a nearly decade-long policy agenda to change the UK's economic geography and narrow the geographical inequality gaps through 12 levelling up missions. And a central plank to the white paper and to many of those missions is devolution. And in specifically, the white paper sets out a rationale and a framework for spreading devolution to more places. And to help this aspect of the agenda, it's set out a 3-tier menu for places to pick from. So today we're going to focus on how devolution might be delivered through this 3-tier model. We're going to look at some of the challenges for local government and central government in the framework that's been set out in the white paper. Is there anything in the white paper for the existing metro mayors? And if not, does this matter? And whilst we all think devolution is very important, does the public, and if they don't, does it matter? So those are some of the questions, some of the issues we'll try and get views on in the next 60 minutes through with my great panel. As always, before we start, a couple of words of housekeeping. As always, the event is being recorded and will be made available on our website along with the slides after the event. During the event, your microphones will be kept on mute. If you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is delivering devolution. You can post questions to our speakers throughout the event, and you do this using the Q&A function towards the bottom of your screen, and we'll be done by 1 o'clock. So let's get underway. Let me introduce my panelists. Our first panelist is Nicola Moss. Nicola is Managing Director of Ipsos Mori North and Head of CSR for Ipsos Mori. Our second panelist is Andy Westwood, and he's Professor of Government Practice and Vice Dean for Social Responsibility in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester. And our third panelist is Nicola Headlam. Nicola is the Chief Economist and Head of Public Sector at Red Flag Alert. And amongst many other things in her past, she was the head of the Northern Powerhouse Strategy Refresh. So Nicola's going to start by giving us some insights from the latest polling that they've been doing around the public awareness of devolution and attitudes towards levelling up. And then Andy and Nicola Hitch will set up their views, and then we'll get into some of the questions, and I'll throw in some that you're going to post, I'm sure. So Nicola Moss, you're first up. You're going to share some slides. Over to you.
I am. Thank you, Andrew. Right. I'm going to try and share my screen now. If you can let me know when you can see what I can see.
Yep.
Yep. Brilliant. Okay. Let me just squash you into the bottom there. Okay. Right. Well, good afternoon. I have been asked to share with you what the general public think of devolution as a mechanism to support the government's levelling up agenda. So before I do that, I guess the first question is whether or not the debate is actually on their radar. We ask the general public on a monthly basis what they consider to be the most important issues facing Britain today. And I suspect had we asked this question, 2 weeks later, then international security would certainly be in the top 5 responses. But as you can see, rising inflation and a lack of faith in politicians, politics and government is certainly coming to the fore. You can see those orange and red lines at the bottom there coming up to meet that black line, which is the pandemic. And this is interesting, and I think it's certainly the government's credibility or lack of feeds through to who is best to govern at a local level, and I'll be bringing that up later in the slides. I think it's also worth noting then that poverty and inequality sits just outside of the top 5 as the most important issue. Indeed, there has been high recognition of such inequalities in the past decade since austerity. So, are the public following the debate? Yes, people are starting to sit up and notice. From our latest polling, half of the public have been following government plans to level up. 15% say they have been following very closely, And if we look at the sort of the breakdown by key demographics, I think what's interesting is, it's young people and Labour voters who are taking the most notice, which is an interesting nuance given this is, a flagship Conservative government policy. And it's not just in the red wall seats either, it's in the north. If you look at this chart, you can see 56% of those in Greater London are following the story closely, which is exactly the same proportion as in the north. So there is interest, but is devolution a priority? To get a sense of which of the government's missions struck a chord with the general public, we asked which should be prioritised for the UK. And you can see of all the missions listed, devolved power to those areas which want it is a kind of mid-league table priority for the general public. So it is coming below jobs, crime, antisocial behaviour, mental health, public transport, education, but certainly above skills and training and decent private rented accommodation and pride and culture. And when we look specifically at those who say local decision making should be a priority for their local area, it is a greater priority for those in the north of England. You see 21% saying that's the case, which is, virtually double those who say that in the south. So it's mid-league in compared to the other missions. But when we ask directly about support, how does that actually look? And there is, relatively strong support for devolving decision-making powers out of Westminster. 54% on average say they support such a move, 15% oppose. If you're in the northeast, that is as high as 73% support. If you are in the southeast, you're more likely to say that you oppose such a move. And when we ask the public who's best placed to make decisions on a variety of issues, is it the government? Is it councils? Is it a group of councils or a combined authority? It really does depend on the policy. You can see here the general public is very confident in local decision-making around housing, transport, crime and policing, slightly more split when it comes to health and social care, schools and further education, and then really not so sure when it comes to new infrastructure projects and manipulating the welfare system. They think that should be perhaps a national decision-making priority. So I guess from my perspective, this is perhaps challenge number one. What is the scope of the devolved powers, be it level 1, 2, and 3, and how you're going to take the general public with you? So who is best placed to deliver? So let's start with the general public. How much influence do they feel they have? This is a government metric in terms of measuring the success of devolution. And they do feel they've got greater influence over local decision making, but it is still pretty low at 26%. And it's lower still if they consider the influence they have across the country. But caution, those low levels of empowerment do not necessarily mean there's a desire for engagement. You've got 3 and 5 there saying that, they don't really want to be involved in decision making either at a local or a national level. So perhaps this is challenge number 2. So how are local mayors perceived? 52% think they have had a positive impact when it comes to delivering services to the cities and regions they represent. And you can see there's really not much in it between those areas which are and are not represented by elected mayors. And indeed 9 in 10 believe it's really important for government to work with elected mayors when deciding how to deliver funding for various levelling up projects. So what of government? Brexit's done, now entering into a post-pandemic economy with many challenges. And we saw in my first slides that a lack of faith in politicians and politics and government generally was a rising issue. And these infamous Christmas parties have taken their toll on the public's perceptions. Johnson's ratings, you know, they are as low as Theresa May's when she left office. So, and Starmer is, you know, here making substantial gains. So what are the implications for levelling up and governance? We asked the public which party, of any, do they trust most to deliver on a number of these issues, and you can see there reducing the inequalities between different regions is at the bottom of that chart there. And what that shows is 14% trust the government the most to deliver on its flagship policy. And Labour has caught up pretty much on all issues, but the biggest lead does relate to levelling up. And in a bid to understand why that might be, it's perhaps worth reflecting on some of the traits which are recognised in the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition, you know. And you can see that being grounded in the needs of ordinary people, honesty and integrity are where there are some of the biggest discrepancies between Boris and Keir. So to summarise, levelling up is creeping up the general public's agenda. There is concern about the government's ability to deliver a levelled up UK, and effective leadership at a local level will be key in taking the public forward.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Nicola. Lots of food for thought. I remember when we had your colleague Kelly on just before Christmas, we were discussing in part whether naturally levelling up as an idea and as an issue sits more comfortably with the Labour Party than it does with the Conservative Party. I think there's something interesting there in your findings, which we might want to explore as we move in. But let's move on and hear some reflections on the role of devolution in the white paper and levelling up agenda more broadly from Andy. So Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Nicola. A fascinating set of slides. So, you know, those of us interested in local government reform and devolution over recent decades have rarely seen numbers like that. Let's put that in context straight away. So that's you know, a really interesting place to sort of start and to frame this discussion. Turning back to the white paper, we've obviously all had a chance to digest it now, and I think you know, trying to put that in a similar context. Obviously, after a kind of period of it being stalled, partly understandably because of COVID, but also I think it's taken quite a long time for this government to decide what it wanted from devolution, let alone what it meant by levelling up. But in the levelling up white paper, the devolution narrative is pretty strong, you know, and we should acknowledge that and give credit where it's due. And in some of the plans that they are rolling out for devolution, I think you know, I think there's reason for us to be relatively optimistic. If they materialise in the way that we might hope. New city region arrangements in Plymouth, Hull, Nottingham, Derby, you know, these seem pretty sensible to me. The encouragement for the West Midlands and Greater Manchester to further develop their devolution arrangements and powers, I think, is also a good step, as are the pilots, the innovation kind of pilots, accelerators that are being brought forward in both of those places, and also Glasgow in Scotland. There are some areas I'm less convinced about. So some of the freestanding county stuff, Andrew is obviously much more familiar with the Northeast than I am. I welcome the suggestion that north of Tyne might embrace some of the land to the south of the Tyne. I recognise how tricky that will be locally, but I still can't get my head around Durham and how some of those county deals do or don't complement or get in the way with some of the kind of more obvious functional economic areas that these city regions and the combined authorities represent. So, you know, but on the whole, the kind of devolution language, the ambition, and some of the specific plans, I think, are pretty good ish. Let's say that. I also like, I'm in a kind of positive mood today. I also like a lot of the economic analysis. which with Andy Haldane kind of holding the pen on lots of this, you know, you'd expect to like quite a lot of that. You know, have followed him and agreed with him on lots of areas around economic development, inequality between places, and on economic development and industrial strategy over the years. So I think, you know, I think there's some good economic analysis in the paper. I don't know how much the Treasury share it, which is a kind of question that I think, you know, you have to put alongside that judgment of the white paper's economic analysis. But the main kind of comments I wanted to make today were really where those two things do or don't come together. You know, so how do the plans for devolution fit with the economic analysis and the prescription for how to level up, how to meet those good jobs and that economic growth that you know, according to Nicola's data, are quite high up in the public's priorities, and to try and answer that, you know, another area I really like is this framework of the 6 capitals. I think that's pretty solid stuff. I mean, you know, whether we agree with the exact names, I mean, the broad things that they're referring to, I think, are pretty strong. So financial capital, physical capital, human capital, intangibles, where mainly R&D and innovation sits, social capital, and institutional capital. I think this is a pretty good framework. But to try and get back to that sort of central question about how that economic analysis marries up with the plans for devolution, if you unpack each of those capitals, what you basically see is that the majority of levers and resources in each are still very much concentrated in the centre. So at the local level, whichever level of the kind of devolution framework we're looking at, from mayors and combined authorities at the top, down to kind of, you know, down through sort of intermediate levels that the white paper sets out to, and then down to sort of local government as ever at the bottom, you know, what you see is still very little kind of purchase on the things that will change those capitals, and the lack of them in areas that need turning around the most, and which, after all, sit at the heart of the whole levelling up approach. So, you know, so really, I would sort of summarise all of that and say, you know, some really helpful kind of plans and ideas here, but at the heart of it, when we think about devolution specifically, the lack of levers, resources, and kind of purchase on those 6 capitals, as well as the coordination of them as they need to come together in local towns, cities, and regions, I think still leaves us with a bit of a gap and a bit of a problem. And unless we can start to match those identified areas, those capitals, with powers at the devolved level, I think we're going to continue to struggle a bit with a relatively unambitious devolution framework to meet the various good ideas that white paper does cover and summarise quite well. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andy. I mean, great reflection there at the end around, you know, you can see the menu of options and the list of things that different tiers get. But as you say, when you look at the 12 missions and the sort of big things, much of it is outside, and it's really unclear as to how local government collectively and, you know, as groups actually influences some of those government spends, and whether they do it through a devolution lever or they do it through some other means. I'd be interested to get your kind of thought on that as we get into Q. But let's turn to Nicola H. And Nicola, I think you've got a couple of slides you're going to use, and then we'll get your reflections, and then we'll open up. Don't forget to post your questions or reflections in the Q&A function, and we will try to get to some of them as we get into the Q&A section. But Nicola, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Waving to the invisible audience out there. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Andrew. And thank you very much for mentioning one of the careers I've failed at, which was civil servant. Prior to that, I'd also failed as an academic career. And I'm currently extremely hopeful that my career as an economist within the private sector is going marvellously well so far. What we've got, I love this slide. mainly because the cars move. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the prompts that we were given prior to the discussion and to reflect a little bit on where we are. I'm not feeling very positive today, so whatever Andy had for breakfast, it was something else. And I'm determined to get in my niche nerd devolution joke. So here we are. Since we have 2 Andrews and 2 Nicholas, we could either be Anna in the same way that you create ABBA, the band, or we could be A2N2. Now, if that isn't the most niche economic development joke you've ever heard, then I'll be here all week. Right. So I'll move on from the traffic. Here we are. So the busy bee diagram here has been, again, many ghosts of careers I've failed at, which has been moving between government, between business, between research, and the notion of living labs as hot houses for innovation is something that I've been interested in for about 20 years. I now run a living lab within my company, and I've got to say, it's fantastic. We've been doing work on growth scores, looking completely differently at aggregate data on the ways in which some companies grow and some don't, separating out quite aggressively from whether growth is about numbers of jobs, number of businesses, productivity, or some people talk about growth in terms of companies ingesting capital. So that's basically my day job. Come and join, it's fantastically fun. The Living Lab, we've got a whole bunch of Growth Hub clients, and we talk about the kind of big stuff and the small stuff. And the next one's the 5th of April, so that's the advert out of the way. Oh, hang on, I just tried to advance my slide. Oh no, I haven't got control. Right, the first question we were asked to consider was the view of the current state of English devolution. This is my first slide, which says, this looks like a dog's breakfast, terribly sorry, so wrong table. English devolution, both in the main problem is the problem identified by the good professor just previous to me. The economic analysis and the governance are just not speaking to one another in a way that is productive. So English devolution at the current time, I would argue, and have done stridently at different times, that it's the English political economy which is a mess, right? So if you see slightly nerd distinction, but it's a mess. I am not one of those people that thinks that devolution needs to be neat, but I do think it needs to work. And what I think is fascinating at the moment, the people that are the most peeved about the stop-start of Northern Powerhouse and all these kinds of things are the private sector. They don't really want to relearn every 5 years what the institutions are. They want to know what the business support offer is, what's available to them, and they want to have some confidence that they've got people they can deal with. It's sort of in extremely bold terms. And this notion that we smash everything up every 5 years and then wonder why everything's broken, this is not mature policy. So yes, the sort of political economy of England is kind of a dog's breakfast. Next slide, please. And when asked what is my sort of take home on the white paper, I love this slide, not just because there's builders and a skip. The white paper is a skip, not a scalpel. There's a lot in it, but again, call me old-fashioned. I think policy is better when it is forensically designed and targeted on a very small area, not a skip. And that is no disrespect meant to any of the people that have tried to make it a kind of generation-defining document. We've already mentioned Andy Haldane. I would argue that some of his industrial strategy stuff has been left in bays. That's slightly problematic. But again, this thing about smashing everything up, that was only last year. It isn't that we've stopped disestablishing things and then reforming them. It's just ongoing. So yes, the headline is that the white paper is a skip, not a scalpel. If you do the next slide. Oh, I like this one. And the reality of levelling up, whilst obviously we are discussing this new language, the missions and the capitals, we've all taken a kind of Bourdieu and turn into what makes a successful area. I'm quite motivated by the sort of reality, which is the brilliant quote by John Elledge as regards the HS2 Eastern Extension. It is like cutting your cat in half and saying this is the integrated rail plan, and saying this is better because everyone gets a bit of cat. I love that, and I think that's completely right. If you could move on to the next slide. Also, given the years of development at the Transport for the North level and the work from the Mayoralties and others and the MP11 and, you know, where we are with certainly the eastern leg of HS2 is as like a reverse supermarket sweep, with the northern leaders being led around the supermarket, putting things back on the shelves that they thought they'd already secured, and that is not a good look for anybody. So if we want to talk about leadership, that's a tough gig, right? You know, there's things that appeared to have been secured in the last 5 years, which seem to now be back on the table. This is not sensible stuff. I think this next slide is my last slide. Not sure. Yeah, and then we had a very specific question, which was the role of the 9 regional levelling up directors. If you see here, we've got John Major on his Cone helpline. It's a little appreciated fact that the government office network was a product of the mid-90s, and the subsequent kind of destruction of that later, once it had swollen into the regional development agencies, the regional assemblies, etc. So we are in some ways back to the future, back to this moment in regional policy. The difference, though, was for the major subnational governance kind of point was that the nations were in an even worse state, right? So mid-90s devolution policy to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland didn't really exist. They just had the Grand Committee system. Now, if we're poised and we're moving from government officers of the regions levelling up directors who are outposts of Whitehall back in the regions, again, I think this is definitely sort of mid-90s regional policy, then what we've got to look forward to are the development of institutions at scale. But, and this is the final thing I will say, the relative maturity of the devolution settlement in the nations of the UK outstripping the regions of England puts us in an even worse position, right? So the nations are able to make quite compelling cases, and you can see it along any data that you choose to use, public spending per head, for example, which is quite compelling. And so it isn't just that we've gone back to the future on devolution to have kind of that decentralization notion of powerful regional directors. Whilst the nations of the UK are sort of, you know, on a one-way trajectory towards independence, arguably, things like UK SPF it becomes a problem because, and I should have had a last slide here, which was a pie, UK SPF being hypothecated to the nations of the UK and Cornwall means that in the English case, the economic development funding that will be available, not only is it going to be a smaller pie, but it's going to be cut into ever decreasing slices, and there's going to be more spoons in the dish. So there we are. That's the last extended metaphor I will leave you with. And if any of that made any sense, then hurrah, and I'll see you on Twitter to discuss.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicola. It made perfect sense. Good, and you did miss out on that last slide, which I think might, to finish off the visual impact would have been a nice way. So, that next time you do the presentation, add that slide in. Right, we've had some questions in. If you've got more questions for our team panel, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll look through them and pull some out. I want to start really by this recognition that, which I think we all agree with, that devolution, or the notion of it, provides a set of challenges for central government in the way that it operates, and the white paper says something about that, and it presents some challenges for local government as it currently is, about how it then deals with itself, and maybe there is some reform in that, and invariably that's about powers and choices and trade-offs and on all those kinds of things. So I'm going to come to Andy and Nicola H in a second for some of the challenges. But Nicola Moss, starting with you, in a sense, does public awareness and public attitudes preferably in favour of devolution. Does that matter then when we get to the difficult moments for central government or local government, because it creates an extra bit of pressure for them to work through those challenges, or rather than avoid them? How does public attitude kind of work in that sort of space?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, accountability is very important for the general public. They want to be able to trust who is in charge, and that therefore that requires a degree of measurement. And how do you measure that performance? They talk about people being involved in decision making, but as you can see, that there is not a will really for people to get highly involved in sort of forcing those agendas. So, I mean, you have to take the general public with you. And I just wonder whether that sort of like feeling involved should actually be feeling informed and keeping people informed of what's happening. And I think linked to that then is how you measure performance, and how the general public can actually see how that performance is being measured. And that leads back to engagement. And at a local government level, there is no real sort of benchmarks or consistency in measurement at all for the general public to say.
No, yeah, that is a very good point. That's picked up in the white paper. So let's just unpack that a little bit more. Andy, come to you. So pick up from Nicola's points there about trust, accountability, performance. There's an engagement versus an awareness and an involvement. All of those sorts of things are playing out. There's a set of challenges, but your view on the challenges for central and local, I suppose, in thinking seriously about the next phase of devolution. What's your kind of take on that?
Well, I think again, as Nicola's slides show, I think people still expect that sort of coming together of central and local government. It's the classic getting multi-level governance right. There isn't a way where you can't avoid or shouldn't seek to avoid the different tiers of government functioning effectively together. And we often underestimate that, I think, but it's a simple point that needs to be made. I think from other survey data that we've kind of looked at over the years, obviously, kind of trust in politicians nationally and locally is incredibly important, but the proximity of decisions, this is the whole taking back control agenda, of course. People feel like decisions should be made closer to them, and there's been a kind of a big increase over time in voters sort of seeking for settlements that sort of reflect that. That isn't the only thing that matters, of course, and I think I would argue that in any of the specific plans for devolution, or how we get to a place where multi-level governance works, we need to think very carefully about the institutions that we're creating and trying to kind of build capacity in. So this could be seen as the sort of the dullest part of the whole discussion, but the capacity of institutions that kind of that acquire new powers is incredibly important to get right. And I think going back to the white paper, this is sort of deep in that institutional capital point. So going back to those 6 capitals that I mentioned earlier. The capacity of institutions working together at the local level, and by that I don't just mean local government, it might be how local government works with regional government, it might be how local government works with kind of key employers, as well as institutions like universities and colleges, bringing those together and kind of building that capacity and building the way that they coordinate together so that decisions can be taken better locally, so that institutional capacity is increased, is really hard to do. But you've got to get it right. Otherwise, going back to the trust or the lack of it in politicians, all you're doing is bringing a lack of trust and disappointment closer to home, along with kind of decision making, if you like. Yeah. So I guess those are the sort of reflections I'd make on this at the moment. But just to say that proximity of capacity is really, really important.
And you've talked about, bring Nicola H in a second. You've talked about before, Andy, I've seen, you've written already on the white paper, the kind of the slight irony going on where we probably do need more institutional reform at the central and the local level to achieve levelling up. But one of the reasons we're in the position we are in relation to levelling up is because we've constantly had institutional reform at the central and local level. So why is it like one more push? Why this time is good? Why are we going to be right this time rather than all the other previous times? It was. I know you've kind of talked out this kind of paradox, irony, but how can we be more confident that this time it'll work? What do we know now that we didn't know before?
Yeah, so our friend and colleague Max Nathan described this as the Westwood paradox.
The Westwood paradox.
Right.
I didn't want to use it in case you trademarked it already, and I would have to then pay you royalties. But...
No, definitely not. But it was very kind of him to mention it in that way. But it is a paradox. And I think it's in the work that we've done at the Productivity Institute, which I should have mentioned earlier. That institutional churn and the weakness of institutions, particularly outside Westminster and Whitehall, is a real problem.
Yeah.
And I think so is and this goes to Nicola Headlam's kind of point about political economy. So is this desire at the central level within Westminster and Whitehall to kind of treat institutional change as kind of their own playthings, really, that you can constantly rip up and start again or reconfigure. And I think having spent a lot of time in central government myself, I think there is a behavioural problem that in any area of reform, and by no means it doesn't only apply to levelling up and regional disparities. It certainly applies in things like skills and industrial policy, for example. The one last push mentality. These are the changes that are going to last because they're the right ones, is endemic.
Yeah.
Every minister writing every white paper, it tends to fall prey to it. These are the things that are going to stay in power. And I think the only way you're ultimately going to change that is by breaking out of the cycle that it's central white papers that make these decisions. Which again takes you back to that sort of that political economy and that kind of over centralisation of the English state. Okay,
Nicola H, let's come to you. I mean, reflections on what you've heard from Nicola and from Andy, by all means. I'm interested now in that sort of next area, which is the white paper in relation to devolution, at least as I see it, is really about spreading, right? It's about more breadth, more places in England getting devolution. It's not really about depth, which is the places that have currently got it getting more. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Does that matter? Do you care about that? Should we care about that? Or do we have to allow other bits of England to catch up before we can move on? But so again, reflections on that. We'll kind of go round in circles on those kinds of things. But Nicola H, your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, it's absolutely disastrous that levelling up can mean a Punch and Judy show on the end of the pier. I mean, those of us who always flip to the back of a document just for vanity to see if there's any reference to us, and there wasn't in the white paper, so I felt very sad about that. There was 80 pages which showed with a complex system of maps that levelling up was everything everywhere that might grab anyone's vote at any time. That was the most dispiriting part for me, because even if we were seeking a more scalpel-like analysis, and don't get me wrong, there is good stuff in there, by the time you get to the IKEA catalogue of regeneration at the back, it's once again, as you say, it's jam spreading, and not particularly nice jam, I don't think. So I'd like to pick up on something that Andy said about capacity building, because it's, again, reflecting on what you need to actually do stuff. I mean, in some ways I'm kind of less and less interested in the hubris and more interested in what are the conditions under which people can gather the appropriate scope at the scale at which they're working and do stuff. So your colleagues in the planning school where I did my PhD talk about scope at scale. and the soft spaces of governance and all of this, and that you can get an awfully long way sometimes at different scales. And again, I had quite an unusual local government career in that I had quite a lot of scope at that scale at that time. So also it's very disempowering to talk about the good people of local government as if they are literally just waiting for manna from heaven to drip on them from the centre. I mean, the strategic capacity to do this kind of thinking is gone outside of the big conurbations, as we know, who've retained some capacity. Also, in terms of like getting sort of more serious and more kind of granular about it, let us reflect, if we may. If we're talking about visibility and accountability, as you were, Nicola, about the public being able to know who to go to, let us consider the Nick Forbes issue. So it's not the Westwood paradox, it's not as important as that, but Nick Forbes, convened the Convention of the North in a way that the leaders were able to form a soft space of governance and a loose network. And if you, a million years ago, the David Cameron cabinet of mayors, which was always you devolve, but then they had a sort of strong voice at the centre. So the Convention of the North sought to pull together those who were in those horrifically hard jobs. Hats off, everybody, because having devolution without the correct power and resource is a unique. I mean, well, as we've seen from Dan Jarvis, he's done 2 terms and just been like, yeah, no, this isn't doable. So Nick Forbes, when Gove came in like 2 weeks ago or a week ago, Nick Forbes was there for the convention, the political leaders. The next day, he went to a selection meeting and was deselected at ward level. So he was representing the political north on Tuesday, and then he was no longer a councillor. Now, this is ridiculous because his status as leader of Newcastle City Council is predicated on a neighbourhood level of the smallest unit of democracy reselecting him to be a Labour councillor in Newcastle. There's no safety then for any politician to make not even radical, but just any representations to central government on the basis that they're on it's a proxy mandate, right? The only scale at which they've got genuine safety is the ward level.
Yeah.
So Nick Forbes is no longer going to have that role as like the voice of the whole North because of an issue at the neighbourhood level. I mean, there's so many scales in between. You're stretching every mandate. The democratic deficit is just enormous. And we found when we were at the Heseltine Institute and we did the review work on the city mayor at the time, you remember this, Andrew, it was years ago. The first thing when the incumbent shifted over from being the leader of the council to being the city mayor, they were operating, we did this analysis of every 15 minutes of their diary and blah, blah, blah. They were operating globally and internationally and at MIPIM and at conferences and representing brand Liverpool. And the immediate casualty was any form of neighbourhood, local or ward level activism. You're no longer at the Scout Hut if you've got to be on a panel about global property development. And the point is that their mandate, his electoral mandate, is here, and then their ambit of influence is right up here. Sorry, I'm sort of ranting now, but that's just it's all very well to talk in abstraction about leadership and accountability, but this paradox sits right at the heart of anybody who's able to speak on behalf.
That is part. I agree with that, but that is part of an argument for having mayors, right?
We're having institutions.
Institutions led by directly, city, region, or combined authority institutions that take more than the local view and they have elected individuals that are also elected from more than the local. I mean, in the sense that Jamie Driscoll in that part of the world is meant to take a north of Tyne view, and he's not beholden to any one ward or any one particular part of his constituency, in theory, right?
But in that case, exactly that. In order to get good coverage for the Northeast, you need a cabinet of people. If mayoralties are about visible leadership, then central government can't cope with 40 or 50 people in a room.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I guess reflections on that from colleagues. I wanted to, Nicola Moss, come back to you, and then again, I want to try and get your sense on this breadth versus depth. In your polling, or your kind of work, is it clear that the public, they know? Do they know that Greater Manchester has got a mayor, and that say London has got a mayor, and do they say we want one of those, or do they not know and they don't care? Where there's a big appetite in the white paper to spread devolution everywhere, particularly across England. I wonder whether at the public level, and I'll get Andy to say something at the local government level, is there a clamour for we want our Andy Burnham, or we want our Sadiq Khan, or we want our Tracy Brabin, or whoever it is? Have you got anything on that, Nicola Moss?
Well, I think it's clear to see from the kind of the polling at government level that the general public are feeling let down and unable to deliver on the levelling up agenda because they don't have local boots on the ground understanding what local issues are. And I think that's where the popularity of the mayors is that is the visible leadership. They are the voice of the local people. And possibly, one of the challenges with the structural reform, when there isn't a mayor, is who is that accountable person? And when we were doing some qualitative work, asking people what they thought of levelling up, and it was very much around the kind of, well, who's marking whose homework, who's looking at these decisions, who's making these decisions, are they representing me? And I think having that very visible leadership is important.
Yeah.
So yes, I think elected mayors do matter to the general public.
Okay, that's very good. That's super helpful. Andy, what's your sense of the wider kind of local government appetite for the form of devolution in the way that it's been structured in the white paper? In a sense, the current devolution map, as messy as it is and imperfect, at one level is reveal preferences, right? I mean, people have made choice, or places have made choices about whether they strike a deal or they do not. And in some respects, it just reflects those revealed preferences. I wonder how you think the map emerges. Do you think there's a kind of an appetite for local government, to go down to get to that tier 3, which is the kind of most, but also requires elected mayors and combined authorities? I mean, what's your general take on that?
Yeah, well, it's still, as Nicola Headlam says, messiness isn't necessarily the problem. England is messy. I think the issue is really whether the kind of plans are set out allow that to work, or whether it kind of makes it worse. I wonder, given the kind of menu of things on offer, I mean, knowing as we all do that to get to the status of a combined authority, those that do exist, each individual one gives us examples of how at individual local authority level and at individual local authority leader level, decisions have been made where they've thought, okay, we'll go with this. We'll put our differences aside, we'll put our rivalries and identities aside, and we'll create these levels, and we'll do these deals. And I wonder whether the framework that's been unleashed via the white paper, whether that helps individual local authorities to be more likely to do those deals or less likely, given that there are opportunities for them to get some of the powers and the deals at a different sort of spatial level, at a messier level, if you like. So I mean, time will tell. Time will tell whether there's enough for, particularly in the areas that it flags up, whether there's enough incentive for local leaders and local government to sort of to throw their chips in with some of the kind of some of those bigger units of activity, if you like. I do think I do think in the case of your point about what wider and deeper, that there is potentially something in the offer to particularly the West Midlands and Greater Manchester to deepen what it can do and what powers it can have. particularly over kind of economic development. So the innovation sort of point, I think, is actually quite an interesting space for that. So it might also be that from that angle, those incentives are slightly stronger, for even the Durhams of this world to chuck in their chips with both sides of the time combined authority. But maybe even that isn't strong enough for that kind of activity.
Yeah, not quite. Nicola, you're kind of I want to try and get your reflection on. You made this point about, we made loads of points, but the point about capacity being variable geographically and both vertically and horizontally and all of that. I wonder, how do you see the interplay between devolution and then capacity, or capacity then devolution? Because in a sense, if you can only devolve to those with capacity, then you only devolve to certain places. How do we? Is there a circle to be squared there, and which way round should we kind of think about it? Because this is Nicola's point, right? You hear this a lot from government. Well, we'd like to devolve, but really we don't think the capacity's there, and therefore we don't devolve. We don't devolve. There is never any capacity there, and therefore we don't devolve. And round we go yet again. And there's something in there around the trust element and the accountability element that Nicola was talking about earlier on. Nicola Moss, I mean. So, Nicola H, unpack all of that.
Yep. Are you seriously asking me, right, if form follows function or if function follows form?
I am actually very seriously asking you that question.
For that. That's well, I would like to answer a different question if that's all right, Andrew.
Very good. You're a true politician.
I'm not a politician. How dare you? The answer is, the main thing is that having abrogated the possibility to kind of know ourselves at any scale, right? The answer is data, right? If you've got good data, you can mount a case for investment at any scale that seems salient to you, right? There has been, the capacity point makes me laugh because we have abrogated that space to consultancy, right? So again, if you follow, economic development consultancy as I do, your LinkedIn is full of people saying, hurrah, we're celebrating getting this, that, and the other for this, that, and the other place. That's where the capacity is. It's the consultancy. What we've done by, this is another lecture from the Headlam stall, the constant crises, austerity, Brexit, COVID, drinks at work, energy crisis, A, B, C, D, E. We don't have the kind of volatile, uncertain, complex, adaptive organizations in the English subnational to be able to kind of roll with all those punches. And as a result, there is a lot of sort of snake oil being sold back and support being kind of garnered from organizations out with the structures. I mean, I don't know about the form or function, but I do know that if you've got a clear idea of, for example, we work with the growth hubs and we work hard to differentiate between this point I made before. Is growth about number of companies, number of workers, percentage points of productivity? This is back to the skip, not scalpel. If it's all a skip and it's all good and it's all growth and it's all leveling up, then it doesn't really matter if you're clear or not. It just feels to me that in the right hands, a finer analysis might lead to better targeted economic development policy that might actually do something.
Okay, that's fair. Okay, that's a good point. We've had quite a few questions, almost flipping it on its head. Andy, maybe start with you on this one, and we've got about 4.5 minutes left. So short and sharp, and we'll get through. But there's a lot in the white paper in relation to devolution, but actually about the way the national government or central government works. How should we think about that? Because we've heard this a lot, right? I mean, this is Heseltinian. This is going back to Major's days. This is going back to New Labour, joined up government, etc., etc. We've kind of been there before PSAs and all of that kind of stuff. Government needs to be more spatial. How many times have we heard that? Quite a bit. So just your kind of reflection on that end of the sort of devolution sort of debate, because that needs to change in order for devolution, even in the short run, to be meaningful, never mind in the longer term. So Andy, give me your view on that.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Shame we've only got 4 minutes, but
Yeah, I know.
Joining up government, the kind of hardest thing of all to do, and you can see it. You can see it in action in the white paper, where some of the conversations with some departments have clearly gone better than with others. As I said in my initial comments, for all of the interesting stuff in the economic analysis, we don't know whether the Treasury buy it. And if the Treasury don't buy it, the Treasury doesn't spend the money, and that's a problem. I mean, this is where I have quite a bit of sympathy for the Department for Levelling Up, who are trying to join up. They are trying to coordinate these different actors, and they're trying to do that through the missions and through the sort of framing of the analysis. It is incredibly hard to do, and I think kind of when you look at the missions and their variability. The education one, for example, the skills one, which we know incredibly important, is very weak and unambitious. This is really, really hard to get right, and so credit to them for trying. But what I don't see in the white paper, not just from the Treasury, although clearly they're crucial, but from other departments too, I don't see enough buy-in from those big silos in Whitehall to allow either some of these big things to be addressed, or to let the Department for Levelling Up to actually drive it in the first place. Yeah. So I do have some doubts on that front.
Yeah, that will be the test, right? Is to see the extent to which, I mean, and it will require quite a bit of political heft to make those other departments. So Nicola H, some reflections on that question, and then I've got a different final question for Nicola M on the politics of levelling up and what we might take from that. So Nicola H, your reflection on central government and all of that?
Professor Westwood is right, of course, that joining up is hard again. And if I didn't been any good at it, I might still be a civil servant. The point is that Michael Gove, on arrival, did the thing that was most necessary as regards using the existing borrowing of Whitehall in the most effective way. And forgive me, Andy, you've heard me say this before, by arriving and re-establishing the EDX subcommittee of the cabinet with Simon Clarke as his deputy. That was missing when I was trying to do the thing. And that in normal times, again, in the absence of uncertainty, complexity, and crisis, that would be the place at which anything that was going to cost money would not be a surprise to the Treasury, right? It would have been, there would be an agreement at that level, cabinet minister subcommittee empowered to discuss spending decisions, and then where that money is going to come from. And Simon Clarke, as we all know, lately of this parish, incredibly good on this agenda. But as Andy said, let's just be real, the fact that there is not a whiff of the Chancellor in this document is because the very hard, long-term and expensive mission of levelling up landed at the point at which we were watching Prime Minister's questions week to week to see if the government was going to survive. So joining up, if there was a strong mandate, and I say, and for what it's worth, again, both Gove, the civil servants doing it, Haldane, etc., they're about the best in the business. Yeah. They're giving it a really good go, trying extremely hard to do it. But even with good weather, this is very hard. And it's been frankly pissing down for years now. So
Okay, nice, very good. Right, last question to you, Nicola Moss, and it's to do with the politics of levelling up and devolution. So, since it's been it's been every government's agenda to varying degrees, but it's this government's agenda, which is a conservative government, and yet levelling up as an idea seems to resonate quite strongly with Labour voters, or the kind of what people would perceive to be a Labour agenda. Big question, but how do you think then that the politics of ownership of that, how does that play out for Labour and for Conservatives? You've got a minute.
It just shows that it's here to stay. Levelling up is now on the general public's agenda, and they are demanding change and more equality. So regardless of who's in power, they have to take it forward, and whether they smash it up again and rebrand it, they've now got the general public on their backs.
Very good. That is a very hopeful and positive note on which to finish. Well done, Nicola Moss for that kind of reminder that public attitudes matter. They now know about it. That means politicians have to be a bit more disciplined about and ambitious about taking it forward. Look, we could really obviously carry on, but we can't. It's 1 minute past the hour of 1, so we do need to finish. Let me say huge thanks to my panelists, Nicola, Andy, and Nicola. Massive thanks to Policy at Manchester for being fantastic partners on this event, but also on previous and future work as well. Your engagement with us and support is hugely appreciated. Thanks to everybody for joining and posting your questions. We got through the essence of some of them, if not the detail of any of them. So I apologize for that. We've done loads and we will continue to do loads on Leveling Up. It's all there on our website. This event and slides will be on there very shortly. But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks very much for being here. All right.